I think it's clear that we need parliamentary reform. I think Canadians have made it clear to us that Parliament needs to be fixed, both the Senate and the House. I think it's clear through 2 decades of research reports and studies and columnists and books and academics who have studied this subject that Parliament needs to be reformed. And we all know that for the better part of 20 years in this country, various leaders of various parties have promised to address the democratic deficit and to fix our parliamentary institution. And unfortunately, very little bit, if any, has come to pass. And so, with the recent scandals in Ottawa on the Senate, with the recent issues around governance in Ottawa, I think it's becoming increasingly clear to Canadians that we need to do something. And so, these problems that we face in Ottawa, on the functioning of your democracy, on the accountability of elected representatives to you as citizens, is something that hasn't happened in the last 5 years or so. I want to make it clear that I've got, the Prime Minister has my confidence to carry out the mandate given to Conservative members of Parliament in the last election. I've got confidence in the Prime Minister to carry out that mandate and to focus on the job that Canadians gave to us in the last election. So the problems we face in Ottawa are not a result of any one party or any one leader. In fact, if the problems were a result of any one party or any one leader, the solution would be simple. Just change the government, change the leader. But the reality is that I am absolutely convinced that the problems will stay in place unless we change the rules, in Ottawa. And why do we need to change the rules? Well, quite simply, over the last 40 years or more, the rules in Ottawa have changed. They've changed to your disadvantage and to the advantage of party leaders. Quite simply, over the last 40 years in Ottawa, what's happened is the rules have changed to give party leaders more power and control and to make the ability of local members of Parliament ineffective in trying to represent their constituents and their unique regions of the country. And that has weakened democracy. It's weakened democracy for 2 reasons. First, it's become increasingly difficult for individual members of Parliament to stand on principle against the party line, but it's also become more difficult for members of Parliament to stand on behalf of you as your elected MP if constituents in the riding feel strongly on an issue against the party line. And why is that? I think there's 3 rule changes that have taken place that created the situation. First, in October 1970, the government of then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau changed the elections law in Canada. They changed the elections law to give the party leaders in law the final approval over party candidates. And so for the last 44 years in Canada, party leaders have had the party veto over locally nominated candidates. And so today, we are the only Western democracy where by law, the party leaders have this enormous power. The second change that's happened over the last 20 years, 30 years or so, is that party caucuses in Ottawa used to be places which were formal decision-making bodies. Like the floor of the House of Commons where votes took place, party caucuses used to be places where the caucus membership, your elected representatives, came together as a party caucus and made decisions, adopted motions, adopted resolutions that were binding on the party leadership. That no longer is the case. They're still important bodies, but they're no longer bodies where the chair of caucus is elected, like it is in every other organization, whether you've got a board of directors that elects the chair of the board, or whether you've got a not-for-profit corporation where the members come together and select the chair and the leadership of the organization. Caucus chairs are no longer elected but appointed, and caucus no longer makes decisions in a formal way that are binding on the caucus leadership. And the third reason of the change that we now face is that for the better part of 50, 60 years in this country, caucuses had a say in the party leader. And about 90 years ago or so, we severed that link between the party leader and his or her caucus. And so as a result of these 3 changes, the ability of members of Parliament to represent you in Ottawa has actually flipped on its head. And more often than not, members of Parliament represent the party's views to the rest of the country. And that is a situation that has got to change. So, Reform Act was introduced in December of last year, just a mere 2 months ago, and it proposes to rectify these three problems by doing three things. By first, restoring local control over party nominations. Secondly, by defining in law the structure and governance of caucus by saying that there has to be a caucus chair, and that caucus chair has to be elected by caucus members, and by defining the rules for expelling and readmitting a caucus member, saying that it should be a decision of the caucus as a whole and not a decision of the leader himself or herself. And finally, it says that party caucuses have to formally define the rules for reviewing and electing an interim leader. I'm of the view that party caucuses currently have this right. The problem is we've never written the rules down because we got this unwritten constitution from the United Kingdom back in 1867. And where they have written the rules down in the last, since 1867, in the UK and Australia and New Zealand, they've actually put the rules down on paper. Some of them have done it in their party constitutions, others have done it in other documents. We in Canada have never done that in the last 145 years. We've kept the rules completely unwritten, and because of that, they're vague, and nobody's sure of how to use them or when to use them. So the bill simply says we need to get them down on paper so that they're clear and transparent to everybody, not just members of Parliament, but you as party members and you as Canadians. So those are the three changes in the bill, and I believe if these three changes are put into place through this bill, that they will have a profound impact on our democracy. They will strengthen grassroots democracy in this country, and they will strengthen your members of Parliament, your elected representatives' ability to represent you in Ottawa and not the other way around. A couple of other points I want to make about these three changes. The first is that this strengthens grassroots democracy. How does it do it? Three things. First, it restores local control over who the party candidate will be, removing the right of the party leader's veto. The second thing it does is it ensures that the right of party members to elect the leader as they currently do is unaffected, and the right of party members to review the leader as they currently do. In the case of the Conservative Party of Canada, it's after an election where we don't form government, remains intact as unaffected. So party members' rights to elect and review the leader as they currently do remain completely unaffected by this bill. All the bill does is say that caucus in an event of a leadership crisis, like we had in the Canadian Alliance in 2001, 2002, or like the Liberals had in 2003, 2005 timeframe with Martin and Chrétien, when there's a leadership crisis, caucus can't let this drag out for 18 months or 24 months and destroy the party. Caucus needs to come together, make a decision. People will vote, and whoever loses essentially shuts up and puts up with the decision of the majority. It's a 2-week decision. The party then moves on and starts focusing on the matters that are of concern to you as Canadians, rather than 24-month battle internally where they're focused on themselves and in the process take the party down to single digits in the polls. So that's how it strengthens grassroots democracy. I believe it will strengthen the party system too. That's the other point I want to make, is it will strengthen stability in the party system. Why is that? Because we've never written the rules down on the review of party leaders and how to formally go about electing an interim leader. In Canada, whenever political parties have a crisis in leadership, which happens once every 10 years or so, 15 years, it becomes a 2-year drawn-out affair that destroys the party. And so we see the federal PCs go down to 2 seats in the early 1990s. We see the Liberal Party of Canada go from majority government down to only 10% of the House of Commons. They only have about 35 seats out of 308 seats. We see what happened to the Canadian Alliance in the early 2000s, where the crisis in leadership took the party in Ontario down to 2 or 3% in the polls. In other jurisdictions where they've clarified the rules on caucus to review and replace the leader, it's not a 2-month affair, a 2-year affair. It's not a 24-month affair. It's a 2-week affair. And a caucus comes together, makes a swift decision, and so you don't get the huge swings in parties that you see in Canada. I note that when Margaret Thatcher was removed as Prime Minister, in the early 1990s and replaced John Major, the Conservative Party in Britain went on to win a majority government. The Conservative Party in Canada ended up with 2 seats. There are other examples we could use of that coming into fact. So it will strengthen political parties in Canada and resolve crises in leadership much more quickly. So that, in essence, is the bill. I think it will strengthen your ability to participate as party members, regardless of the political party you're in. And I think it's time we did something. Look, for those of you who've been around political parties, especially the conservative movement in this country, we've been talking about the democratic deficit for 20 years now. And for Liberals as well. Liberals, Paul Martin promised to, quote unquote, fix the democratic deficit. He created the Minister for Democratic Reform. There was a great deal of hope and optimism that things would change in Ottawa, but over the last 20 years, little has changed. In fact, arguably, it's gotten worse, the centralization of control. So I think it's high time that we reform both the House of Commons and the Senate, and I strongly believe that reform of Parliament should begin in the House of Commons for one simple reason. It's the only vote you folks have. Unlike the United States south of the border, unlike many other systems of government like France, Canadians in a parliamentary system have one vote. South of the border, they got 3. They vote for a president, they vote for a senator, and they vote for a congressman or congresswoman. So when an American wants to express their concerns, when an American wants to have their democratic representation affected, they can call one of 3 people. But here in Canada, you've got one vote at the federal level, and that's for a local member of parliament. And that role becomes incredibly important. And if that member of parliament doesn't have the tools, doesn't have the system to represent you to Ottawa, but rather does it the other way around, then how is that democracy? How does that ensure that Canadians' views are reflected in the nation's capital? So that's why this bill is so very important. I'm going to finish with this final thought. I believe strongly that we live in the best country in this world. One of the most prosperous, one of the best countries in the world, one of the best economies, one of the wealthiest societies on the face of this planet. And for anybody who's ever seen how most of the rest of the world lives, you know how fortunate we have it here. I also strongly believe that that is not an accident. That is not an accident. We have the wealth we have today and the productive economy we have today because of our democratic institutions. If you look around the world, in 192 countries around the world, the most prosperous societies, the wealthiest economies, the most productive systems are democracies. And that's not an accident. And democracy doesn't flow from a wealthy society, from a wealthy economy. Democracy produces a wealthy economy, a productive society. And so if we, in these early years of the 21st century, are going to maintain our productive economies and our wealth for our children and grandchildren, we have to make sure that our democratic institutions are up to the job, to providing the system of democracy that we need in the years coming forward. So thank you very much for listening. I'm more than happy to spend as much time as you.